So thank you, Professor Boghossian. The kind of relativism Mr. Boghossian discusses is epistemic relativism, understood as relativistic views on justification. He offers a first picture of the problem making use of cases proposed by Horthy. For instance, Ptolemaic versus Copernican views of the universe, Galileo versus Bellarmine, and similar controversies. The aim here is to point out to the idea of different sorts of evidence to assert different systems, where we find at the bottom different creeds to determine evidence in favor of different theses. It seems right to say that creeds to determine evidence are constituted by common grounds of accepted relevance and irrelevance of structures of justification which are not objective. Different creeds to determine evidence imply different epistemic systems, where a specific epistemic system should be a fundamental way of justifying beliefs, which employ a specific creed for determining what sorts of evidence there could be for statements. It is obvious that different, perhaps unconnectable epistemic systems employ different creeds for determining what sorts of evidence there could be for statements. If we understand epistemic system this way, it is easy to see that the option for an epistemic system isn't an option for a logical system. It is essentially a non-objective preference. Mr. Boghossian maintains the same line of reasoning when he discusses epistemic systems out of anthropological considerations. We are introduced to the problem of deciding comparisons between a physicist and an oracle's worldview, since the criterion, my expression, for comparisons is each time a language game, which we inevitably can support only by making use of our language game itself. This way, reasons for the use of each language game are at the end persuasions. The considerations on the agenda should provide cases where certain ordinary compared worldviews, like explaining physical events, admitting witchcraft or not, simply collapse. The conclusion to be taken here is that for a significant range of propositions, the agenda employ a significantly different epistemic principle than we would. Actually, a principle that, I suppose, might be called oracle's authority epistemic principle. It is a kind of alternative epistemic principle to our epistemic system. I think it is important to see that the kind of relativism such cases could ground is essentially linked to the ideas of greed, worldview, language game, and, I say, authority epistemic principles. Ideas which structure epistemic systems not on the basis of rational and logical criteria, but not necessarily against rational and logical criterion. Chief concern here is actually that it is possible to think of epistemic systems of justification of many, but certainly not all kinds of beliefs, whose principles are really not and do need not to be objective, where objective should mean independent of any kind of subjective relative preference. In a certain point of his argumentation, Mr. Boghossian seems to admit a distinction, not in every sense explained, between genuine alternative epistemic practices and not genuine alternative practices, where genuine epistemic practices are those directly based on observation, induction, and deductive logic. Matter of debate seems to me to be the idea that secondary, my expression, or not genuine Boghossian's expression, epistemic principles might be connected to irreducible epistemic principles in a certain way, since I think we could think that they do not work in the same manner. What would it be if I think of an epistemic system of justification which includes such irreducible epistemic principles together with a criterion or a grid in terms of, say, revelation for evidence to a large range of beliefs? Secondary or epistemic systems of preference are plainly and trivially possible, in the sense that we can construct them or think of them as containing a condition perhaps immune from objectivity claims, namely preference itself. Actually, Mr. Boghossian does not offer any consideration about this level distinction, even though I admit he tries to conceive epistemic relativism in a more strict sense. Even though I can disagree with Horthy's rejection of the word has an intrinsic nature, and with Horthy's rejection of the claim that one theory may be a better representation of reality than another, I cannot say that this last rejection implies or only implies denying inevitable conceptual logical change. A really very different matter concerns the assumption of a different deductive logic out of the same anthropological considerations, where we see the proposition that for a specific case, the Azande do not seem to adopt modus ponens inferences, but do accept a kind of logic different from ours. I think Mr. Boghossian shows in this case, section 7 of his paper, very convincingly that at the end, genuine epistemic principles seem to be observation, induction, and deductive logic, since there seems to be no way of not taking them for matters of epistemology and meaning as irreducible principles which are in a way independent from any form of further elements of epistemic systems, where further elements might be not irrational principles, more or less related to the idea of preference, but themselves being not preferences. I think it is clear that such further principles should be thought as reducible, corrigible, or changeable epistemic principles, as well as the idea of preference itself. Since the irreducible character those principles have for our epistemic system of rules, it is also correct to say that we cannot even think of other independent basic principles. Exemplary argument for showing that there is not necessarily any denial of modus ponens by the Azande are actually reached in the literature of the area, where certainly the main idea is that the fact that the Azande don't feel disposed to make these inferences does not obviously imply they must be employing a different logic. But it is only in this qualified sense that it is correct to say that it is hard to understand the dispute between Galileo and Bellarmine as a dispute between alternative epistemic systems, just only in this qualified sense, different conceptions of what counts as good evidence for beliefs. The distinction I make following Mr. Boghossian's clues between irreducible epistemic principles and as such secondary epistemic principles fits well to Mr. Boghossian's own definition of genuine epistemic relativism. The view that there are alternative epistemic practices, that there is no objective basis for choosing between alternative epistemic practices as correct or wrong, and that the only truth evaluable propositions there are of the form according to the epistemic practice. C, evidence E, justifies belief B. Formulated this way, Mr. Boghossian's account of epistemic relativism is similar to normative cognitive pluralism, which claims that there is no unique system of reasoning or of forming and revising beliefs that people ought to use because various, quite different systems can all be equally good. So that it makes no sense to ask whether one system is better than another. We only can ask whether one system is better than another for a given person or group. Mr. Boghossian argues that an argument for this epistemic relativism needs an argument for the relativist anti-realist position, whose conclusion must be there are no objectively true epistemic principles. Fundamental aspect for this conclusion is the idea that those objective facts about the epistemic principles should be, in an externalist fashion, knowable and knowable a priori. We think they are not, because to say the contrary is to say that one is able to show the correctness of his principles by justifying the principles of his system using one's own epistemic system. In just a few words, I think it is possible to say that the pro-relativist argument relies on three, not on two, as Mr. Boghossian says, incontestable assumptions. That in evaluating an epistemic system, there is no alternative but to use some epistemic system or other. There is no interesting notion of justification that will allow us to justify a form of reasoning through the use of that very form of reasoning. And third condition, there is no way of deciding for the objective superiority of an epistemic system by invoking a system extraneous or independent of the very same system. I do think this third, in a derived sense, Pyrrhonian assumption is an important one to test Mr. Boghossian's claims about the problem that we cannot use a justification of the one practice over the other without begging the question, since each side will be able only to provide a rule circular justification of its own practice. I come now to this point. Mr. Boghossian has probably strong reason for referring to Nagel's attempts to defend objectivity of rationality by analyzing appeals to reason implicitly authorized by challenges to reason as assuming a kind of rule circularity which do not touch sufficiently the possibility of the universal objective validity of specific superior or preferable forms of reasoning. We should be able to explain in what the supposed objective superiority of our own methods of epistemic systems of justification consists. Apart from Mr. Boghossian's further critics to Nagel's self-refutation argument of epistemic relativism, when put in the form of self-refutation of epistemic relativism concerning justification, and even though Mr. Boghossian seems to adopt the view there is no coherent formulation of epistemic relativism, I believe he presupposes and hence does not escape from a sort of role circularity. He does not escape role circularity in his definite formulation of the problem of epistemic relativism, namely, that it is impossible to see how we might coherently come to adopt a relativist view of our own epistemic practice. Well, this alleged impossibility relies absolutely on the assumption that there is no way of avoiding grounding epistemic principles on those already mentioned genuine epistemic principles for which we just don't know and cannot know even how to formulate genuine alternative epistemic principles. Somehow, a kind of role circularity by invoking the incoherence, not of formulation, but of adoption of relativist views, should be, therefore, disconnected of the argument. In a sense, the deciding for a supposed objective criterion could be thought in different terms. Perhaps, they could be thought in different terms if we pay attention to the kind of critics Newton and Smith turn against Jan Hacking's muted relativism, in which, in Horta's fashion, styles of reasoning determine the sense and the availability of propositions. Essentially, the notion of evidence must be linked to the determining of sense. And what is true evidence can success apart from styles of reasonings, so says Newton Smith, since observational success does offer a style-neutral standard for what is really the case. Similarly, in the context of Quine's thesis for the indeterminacy of translation, Newton Smith argues for a bridgehead of law-level perceptual beliefs and logic which is needed not only for translation as such, or possibly understood as an objective criterion for meaning and belief formation, but which is also not necessarily taken a priori, but a posteriori as an empirical hypothesis for which the predictions of our translation scheme give evidence. If we accept that meaning, belief, and action form a hermeneutical triangle, we could begin comparisons between epistemic systems by hypothesizing a similarity between oneself and someone else's system, Galileo versus Bellarmine, in regard to basic or law-level perceptual beliefs and logic. Being able to form conceptual schemes which explain someone else's greeds for evidence by predicting his either behavior or ways of epistemic justifications, we begin to be able to make interpretations and comparisons whose initial assumptions do not even need to have a priori status, which would not rest on rationality assumptions consisting of what a rational human being cannot fail to believe in simple perceptual situations organized by rules of coherent judgment which a rational man cannot fail to subscribe to. But we could certainly maintain reasonable a posteriori perceptual and logical conjectures which are grounded in terms of better predictive theories as a posteriori perceptual and logical conjectures. Such conjectures, or very humble, non-theoretical sorts of propositions, largely independent of the style of reasoning, being associated with the idea of empirical predictive success, could avoid even circularity in assessing styles of reasoning, even if these ones are thought as, so to say, logical styles of reasoning. But that, therefore, of my argumentation is perhaps not necessary. Isn't relevant to introduce in the discussion something like Nelson Goodman's claim that general principles of inference, we say, in general rules of deductive logic, as well as possible similar arguments with respect to observation and induction, isn't relevant to introduce in the discussion something like Goodman's claim that general principles of inference are justified by their conformity with the particular inference we make and accept, so that through a reflective equilibrium, Rawls' expression, or a process of delicate mutual adjustment, Goodman's expression, our acceptance of particular inferences is justified exactly by according with general inferential rules, general rules of deductive logic. It is indeed a well-known form of virtual circularity, since it is not exactly the same to say that such processes of accepting inferences ground rules of deductive logic as producing agreement and conducting to truth, and to say that simply irreducible rules of deductive logic ground rules of deductive logic. I really think we need ask Mr. Boghossian whether he is not and must not be committed to a specific form of virtuous circularity. We should be told which one. I think this reflection is true when we read the statement that we cannot make judgments of form. B is justified by evidence relative to system C, or making confrontation with different views of the same propositions claiming justification, unless it is true that in a certain level I can explain why I believe Copernicanism and why Berlin rejects it. So that we say what it would mean for one's epistemic systems to be justified to believe. It is certainly true that we are not bare to think such thoughts, since we can explain why we believe one thing and not another. But I just can't understand Mr. Boghossian's affirmation that it is ultimately impossible for the relativist to distinguish himself from the irrationalist, because I cannot think that I have a reason for believing something as opposed to something else just by thinking relational thoughts, but I also have to think something determinate like, and science is the right epistemic systems by which to fix belief. If the relativist cannot abolish this kind of non-relational thought, because such a thought relies upon genuine or irreducible epistemic principles. Here, Mr. Boghossian's argumentation should not be put this way: to think something determinate like, and science is the right epistemic system by which to fix belief. But instead of this, I also have to think something determinate which is inconceivable without irreducible principles. Well, it is obviously mistaken to confound the expression of ideas of preferences and the formulation of regulation through genuine irreducible principles like modus ponens, observation, induction. These last formulations are inescapable, those which represent the most reasonable way of arriving at the truth within our epistemic system, and of arriving at the coherent impossibility of formulating genuine counterparts of epistemic logical alternatives, therefore at coherent relativist epistemic views. This is the reason why we feel attached to them. The decisive idea is that such rules are constitutive of forming beliefs, since forming beliefs, propositional or, according to Dan Sperber, semi-propositional representations, presupposes meaning which has as constitutive possibility logical standards like rules of conjunction and or rules of conditional truth function, so that we have no option but to think of ourselves as trying to figure out how things stand with the world. Again, a good account on correctness or incorrectness of any kind of rule circularity seemed to me to be needed in Mr. Boghossian's argumentation. Well, I still have some comments on your paper, but I must confess they are not well articulated. I would like to stop here and to thank you for your study and hope that certain remarks can produce effectively a good further discussion. Thank you, Professor Boghossian.